welcome to Mentour, yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're all doing fantastic. So, today, as promised, I'm continuing my pilot licensing series with MPL, Multi-Pilot License. Okay. I've had to do quite a lot of research because I haven't had any personal experience with MPL students during my career so far. And I have to say that it's been really interesting to be researching this, and also a little bit frustrating, and I'll explain to you why. So, in order for you to understand what multi-pilot license is, if you compare it to a standard commercial pilot license and air transport pilot license, you have to understand how licensing has been done for the last 70 years. So, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, stipulated how to make or how to train pilots back in 1944. And since then, it actually hasn't been much change in the way that pilots are being trained and pilots are being licensed. Okay, so that means that a person who would be trained to become a pilot back in 1960s, if he or she would be picked up and dropped into a course in 2015, there wouldn't be much difference. They would feel right at home almost immediately. The training organizations, they are like the approved training organizations, and the airline business around the world recognize that we probably need to do something about this. So back in the beginning of the 2000s, ICAO took out about 65 people who sat down and worked for a few years, and they came up with a set of improvements that could be done in the way that we train pilots, so that the training would be more relevant for actual airline flying. Okay, so in 2006, ICAO implemented the MPL into their annexes, which meant that from 2006, all the member states of ICAO, which is pretty much the whole world, could choose to implement multi-pilot license into their aviation authorities and into their licensing authorities. MPL, is important to understand, it was not created to replace CPL. It was created to be kind of a parallel road to CPL, but with a more modern way of training pilots. MPL is a license who is solely supposed to be used for airline flying. Okay, that's the main difference between a PPL, CPL and an MPL. So if you are going for an MPL, you are going for an airline career. You do not do it in order to fly commercial, sightseeing tours or something like that. No, you're going straight for an airline and a multi-crew. That's why it's called multi-pilot license, because it's aimed at multi-pilot organizations. Okay, and multi-pilot operations. An MPL training is based on competency, okay, rather than goal-oriented, it's competency-oriented. And the difference there is that in conventional pilot training, you would need to do a certain amount of hours, and once you have done those certain amount of hours and a certain amount of exercises, providing that your instructor thinks you're good enough, then you can go forward for your skill test. But in an MPL, you work against achieving specific competencies in each area, and once you have achieved that competency, then and only then can you move forward into the next step of training. This is a more modern way of training, and actually this is pretty much the way that we in the airlines are training our recurrent students. So pilots are coming in for recurrent training, we are training them towards core competencies rather than just specific one-fits-all training. And that's also important to remember. An MPL training is divided into, I would say, basically 6 different parts. The first is the selection. This is really important to remember, because if you're going into an MPL scheme, you first need to apply to the training organization and the specific airline, host airline, that you want to attend, or that is hosting the MPL scheme. So the airline, which might be Sterling Airlines for example, or there's quite a few Chinese airlines now that are doing these schemes. They are responsible for the selection of the cadets. So you will go through different types of tests that I've been discussing in previous podcasts, and if you are being selected to the MPL scheme, the airline have selected you to basically join their organization. Okay, so that's a big difference from the CPL, where you are training yourself and then applying. So that's the first stage. If you are then approved to get in, you will go through 4 training stages, which are called core, basic, intermediate, and advanced. Okay. If you go through all of these 4 stages then successfully, then you'll be invited into the line flight under supervision, the LIFO stage, or the line training stage at your host airline. Once that's complete, you will be issued with your MPL, and you will most likely start working with your host airline. So, as a difference from the CPL, where you're kind of trained towards a whole range of different commercial ways of flying, here you will be streamlined towards a specific airline. Okay, and that's a big difference as well. So in the core stage of your training, that one resembles more or less the PPL stage of your CPL ATPL training. The basic will be introduction to multi-crew concept, so you'll be flying with another pilot. There's pilot flying and pilot monitoring. The intermediate stage is also multi-crew, but in more advanced airplane systems. In some airlines or in some approved training organizations, you might start to be introduced to the specific type you're going to be flying already then. But the advanced stage, the 4th stage, is the equivalent of a type rating. So generally the first 2 stages is done at a flight school, and then the second 2 is done under the training organization of the host airline. Okay, so you're being kind of groomed into your first officer position in your host airline, and that's the main difference of an MPL. After your advanced stage, you will have to do your base training, so your touch and go landings, which tends to be a minimum of 12, and then you start your line training and then into the airline. Okay, so why doesn't everyone do this then, and why is it not widely adapted? Well, first of all, there is a little bit of a problem when it comes to if your host airline, for example, would have economical problems, if they would stop recruiting during your training. You are basically stuck with a license who's only valid for that airline. So with the with the CPL licenses, you will be trained, and if you can't get into one airline, you'll be able to apply for a different airline, or you'll be able to go out and fly parachuters or pull gliders or something like that. But with your MPL, you are being streamlined into one specific airline, and if you can't get in there, or if the airline stops recruiting, then the license is basically useless. So that's a big negative, and that's why people are a little bit skeptical. But of course the positive is that once you have been accepted, if you're going in and you're doing an MPL scheme with a reasonably good and financially solid airline, you're never guaranteed anything in this business, but you are very probably going in and getting a job immediately after your examination. So that's the positive and the negatives of them. There's been some skepticism in the industry about MPLs, and to be perfectly honest, I think most of the skepticism has to do with lack of knowledge about the way that the training is being performed, because the way to train a pilot, to do training towards a multi-pilot cockpit work, instead of spending loads and loads of time flying small Cessnas in a single pilot configuration and then just doing an MCC course at the end, I think personally is more suitable for the goal. If your target is to become an airline pilot, then you should be training to become an airline pilot, not to become a private pilot and then a little bit of a switch over to an airline pilot at the end. So I think that MPL makes a lot of sense, but there's been some skepticism, mainly because if you're doing the MPL scheme, you will be flying significantly less in the actual aircraft. The minimum that ICAO stipulated was about 30 hours in the actual aircraft. The rest is to be done in fixed training devices or in full flight training devices, so basically in simulators. The simulators have evolved a lot during the last 20 years or so. So it's not a bad idea. It's actually more cost effective, it's more environmentally friendly to be doing loads of your training in a simulator. But it's been a lot of skepticism in the industry, because this is an industry which is not used to change. And the pilot union organizations, for example, have been stating that this is just a way to reduce the cost for the flight schools and the airlines on the cost of safety. But I think the way that ICAO wrote the MPL description, it's actually supposed to be more safety oriented than the old one. Okay. There are some downsides of not doing a lot of flight training in the actual aircraft. One of them, for example, is exposure to ATC communication. There's been evidence from what I've read that MPL students, especially coming from countries where English is not their primary or secondary language, have a lot of problems with ATC communication. So if you are in an MPL scheme and you go in for a Chinese airline and you feel that you're not really confident with your English, you should be spending quite a lot of your own time preparing yourself for aviation English, because it seems like it might be a problem. Okay. I think that now we've seen almost 10 years of MPL. It has not been as big as ICAO was hoping when they constructed the license, but I think we will probably see, as the training organizations start knowing how to do competency-based training, and the airline industry see the quality of the cadets coming out of the MPL schemes, we will probably see more and more of this. That's what I think anyway. I think there's some tweaks that needs to be made. I think that the licensing authorities has to get better at licensing, because they have been used to just checking logbooks for hours and checking what they do on the skill test, and that's it. Now they are going to have to adapt themselves to checking specific competencies in the cadets. But I think that this probably, in one form or another, is going to be the way forward, the way to train people forward. That's my own personal idea anyway. So, if you have any more questions about MPL as such, then please, as always, write them in as comments below this video. If you like this, then give me a thumbs up. As always, share this with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr, or whatever you are using. And I hope, as always, that you're having a fantastic day, and I hope to see you again in my next